The capture of Nicolas Maduro is being presented to the American public as a triumph of law and order. A simple equation: crime, warrant, arrest. It feels clean. It feels justified. But if you look past the handcuffs, the picture changes completely. What we just witnessed was not a law enforcement operation. It was a military decapitation strike against a sovereign head of state, executed to secure the largest oil reserves on the planet. The administration calls it justice. The rest of the world calls it a warning. We need to be honest about the trade-off we just made. We traded institutional legitimacy for short-term leverage. We secured the asset, but we broke the rules of the road that have sustained American power for 70 years. This isn't about defending a dictator. It is about understanding what happens to a superpower when it stops acting like a leader and starts acting like a predator. The consequences of this decision will not be felt in a courtroom. They will be felt in our alliances, in our economy, and in our ability to lead the world without using force. If you want the comfort of the official story, you can stop listening now. But if you want to understand the actual cost of this victory and where this trajectory takes us next, stay with me. The official story is seductive because it is simple. It offers a kind of moral symmetry that feels, at a visceral level, like justice. You have a man, Nicolas Maduro, who has presided over the systematic dismantling of a wealthy nation, who has starved his people, who has turned the apparatus of the state into a criminal enterprise. And then you have the United States, the indispensable nation, stepping in to execute a warrant. On the surface, this is framed as a victory for law and order. The Department of Justice unsealed the indictments years ago. The charges are specific: narco-terrorism, corruption, drug trafficking. There was a price on his head: $15 million. And now, the operation is complete. The target is in custody. The extraction was successful. The administration stands at the podium and tells you that this is simply the long arm of American law finally catching up with a fugitive. It is a comfortable narrative. It allows us to categorize this event alongside the capture of El Chapo or the extradition of a cartel boss. It suggests that what we are watching is a police action, effectively managed, executed with precision, and justified by the penal code. It tells us that the systems work. But if you step back from the podium and look at the operation itself, not the press release, but the physical reality of what took place, that comfort begins to evaporate. Because police actions do not look like this. When the United States enforces an indictment against a foreign national, there is a process. It is often slow. It is often frustrating. It involves extradition treaties, diplomatic wrangling, local law enforcement cooperation, and a heavy reliance on international norms. Even when we go after high-value targets in non-permissive environments, there is usually a pretense of working with, or at least through, a local framework. This was not that. This was a military decapitation strike against a sitting head of state, executed under the banner of narcotics enforcement. The scale of the assets moved, the level of force applied, and the casualty counts on the ground do not resemble a DEA raid. They resemble the opening salvo of a regime change war. And yet, we are not at war. Congress has not declared war. The American public has not been asked to support a war. We are being asked to accept a category error. We are being asked to believe that the deployment of war-scale violence can be justified by the language of a criminal courtroom. And this is where the unease starts to set in. If this was purely a law enforcement operation, where are our allies? When the United States takes down a major drug trafficker, the international community usually applauds. There is a consensus that stopping the flow of narcotics is a shared good. But listen to the silence coming from Europe. Listen to the hesitant, carefully parsed statements coming from Latin America. They are not celebrating a victory for international law. They are quietly terrified by the precedent of it. They see what we are trying not to see: that the United States just used a drug indictment as a skeleton key to bypass sovereignty. The administration knows this. That is why the narrative is so tightly controlled. That is why the phrase narco-terrorist is repeated with such discipline. It is a linguistic shield. If Maduro is a president, this is an act of war, and it is illegal under international law, and potentially unconstitutional domestically without congressional approval. But if Maduro is a narco-terrorist, then he is just a criminal, and the military is just a very large SWAT team. It is a clever sleight of hand. It lowers the psychological barrier for the American public. We don't like invasions. We don't like nation building. But we love catching bad guys. So they give us the bad guy narrative to hide the invasion mechanics. But look at the cost. Look at the friction it generates. You cannot effectively run a hemisphere-defining geopolitical intervention using the rule book of a drug bust. The pieces don't fit. You have a power vacuum in Caracas that a simple arrest warrant cannot fill. You have a military apparatus in Venezuela that is now leaderless and volatile, something a prosecutor doesn't have to manage. You have the sudden injection of American liability for the future of a country of 28 million people, all based on a legal theory designed to catch cocaine smugglers. The official certainty is a facade. It is designed to keep you from asking the operational questions. They want you to focus on the man in handcuffs so you don't look at the wreckage around him. They want you to feel the satisfaction of the capture so you don't calculate the risk of the precedent. We have to be honest about what we are seeing. We are not seeing the enforcement of law. We are seeing the weaponization of law to cover for something much larger, much riskier, and much less democratic. If this were really just about drugs, if this were really just about enforcing an indictment, it would not have required a fleet, it would not have risked a regional conflagration, and it would not be sold to us with such aggressive simplicity. Something else is happening here. The drug story is the wrapper. But when you tear that wrapper off, you realize that the object inside is not a gavel. It is a weapon. And we need to understand whose hand is on it and what they actually intend to do with it before the dust settles. Because if this was really just about drugs, it would not look like this. If you want to understand the architecture of this event, not the press release version, but the structural reality of it, you have to stop looking at the indictments and start looking at the geology. We have spent days talking about narco-terrorism. We have parsed the language of criminal justice, but we have largely ignored the single most defining fact about the ground on which this operation took place. Venezuela is not just a crime scene. It holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. This is not a footnote. It is the gravitational center of the entire crisis. And it is the only thing that explains the speed, the scale, and the specific nature of the American intervention. Watch what happened the moment the dust settled on the capture operation. While the Department of Justice was briefing the press on criminal charges, the Treasury Department and the energy sector were already moving. The immediate conversation in Washington did not stay on drug routes for long. It pivoted, almost instantly, to production capacity, to crude quality, and to the stabilization of the energy sector. If this were truly a counter-narcotics operation, the priority would be evidence collection, witness security, and the dismantling of cartels. Instead, the priority has been the security of the fields and the reassessment of the crude supply chain. We did not just arrest a leader, we secured an asset. We need to be very clear about what that means. We are looking at a geopolitical seizure disguised as a police action. Think about the timing. We are living in an era of renewed great power competition. The United States is locked in a struggle for leverage against China and Russia. Energy is not just a commodity in that struggle, it is a weapon. For years, Venezuela's oil has been offline or leaking into the black markets of our adversaries. It was a strategic liability, a massive resource pool sitting in the backyard of the United States, managed by a hostile regime and courted by Beijing and Moscow. By removing Maduro, the United States did not just remove a criminal, it removed a strategic obstruction. It effectively took the largest oil reserves in the world off the table for our adversaries and placed them back within the sphere of American influence. This explains the mismatch we felt in the first few days. The narco-terrorist label was necessary to sell the operation to a domestic audience that is tired of war but hates drugs. But the operational reality, the carriers, the sanctions relief discussions, the immediate focus on infrastructure, speaks the language of energy dominance. This was a move to control the global thermostat. By controlling Venezuela's output, the United States gains leverage over global oil prices. It gains leverage over OPEC. It gains a check against Russian energy blackmail in Europe. It is a masterstroke of grand strategy, calculated and cold. But notice how none of this is in the official talking points. The administration cannot say, "We invaded a sovereign nation to secure its oil fields because we need the leverage." That is the language of empire, the language of the 19th century. It is unpalatable to the American voter and unacceptable to the international community. So, they say justice. They say law enforcement. But the mask is slipping. You can see it in the way the operation is being managed now. We are seeing a rush to normalize, not the politics of Venezuela, but the economics of it. The urgency is not about building a democracy in Caracas. The urgency is about getting the pumps working under friendly management. This creates a profound dissonance. The American public thinks they supported a moral action against a bad man. In reality, they authorized a strategic acquisition. And this is where the danger lies. Not in the oil itself. Energy independence is a valid national interest. The danger lies in the deception. When you use the moral authority of the justice system to cloak a resource grab, you compromise the justice system. You tell the world that American law is just a pretext for American interests. We are now in a position where the United States has effectively exerted eminent domain over a sovereign nation's primary resource. We have done so by decapitating its leadership under legal guise. The result is undeniably effective in terms of raw power. The U.S. now holds the cards. The pivot to energy dominance is complete. But we are left with a troubling clarity. The United States acted strategically. It acted decisively. But it did not act transparently. We have secured the oil. But in doing so, we have turned the tools of justice into tools of conquest. And the world is watching and taking notes on exactly how the trick was performed. We have to ask ourselves, is the leverage we gained worth the legitimacy we just spent? Because we just spent a lot of it. We have to talk about how we got here. And we have to do it without falling into the lazy trap of personality politics. It is easy to look at this operation, see the chaos, see the brazenness of it, and shrug it off as simply Trump being Trump. It is easy to say this is just the impulse of a disruptor, a chaotic executive acting on a whim. But that is a dangerous underestimation of what is actually happening. This was not a whim. This was a proof of concept. What we are witnessing is not a personality flaw. It is a systemic contaminant. We are seeing a specific style of governance, Trumpism, applied to national security in a way that fundamentally rewrites the operating code of American power. And the defining characteristic of this code is that it views institutions not as the vehicle for power, but as obstacles to it. In a traditional American framework, power is constrained by design. If you want to topple a regime, you go to Congress. You build a coalition. You go to the UN Security Council. You make a case. These steps create friction. They slow you down. But they also grant you legitimacy. They ensure that when the United States strikes, it strikes with the weight of the law and the backing of the world. Trumpism rejects that trade-off. It views friction as weakness. It views consultation as a waste of time. And so, it seeks a bypass. The capture of Maduro was the ultimate bypass. By framing a geopolitical intervention as a law enforcement action, the administration short-circuited the entire national security apparatus. They didn't have to debate the War Powers Act because, technically, they were just executing an arrest. They didn't have to consult NATO or the OAS because, technically, this was a domestic judicial matter. They didn't have to brief the Gang of Eight on an invasion plan because they weren't calling it an invasion. This is the method. You take a complex strategic problem, you squeeze it into a criminal framework, and suddenly you have absolute freedom of action. You can use the military like a police force. You can ignore borders like a prosecutor ignores a jurisdictional line. It is efficient. It is fast. And it is terrifyingly corrosive. Because when you bypass the institutions, you weaken them. Every time you use the Department of Justice to solve a foreign policy problem, you chip away at the independence of that department. Every time you use the military to enforce a court order in a foreign capital, you erode the distinction between defense and policing. And our allies know it. This is the part the domestic audience misses. We see the victory lap in Washington, but in London, in Berlin, in Paris, there is a profound recalibration happening. They are realizing that the United States is no longer bound by the shared grammar of international relations. They are seeing an ally that is willing to burn down the rules of the road just to get to the destination faster. Trust is not an emotional state between nations. It is a calculation of predictability. And right now, the United States is becoming radically unpredictable. If we can reclassify a head of state as a common criminal to justify an extraction operation, what stops us from doing it to a trade partner? What stops us from doing it to a political rival. The logic has no internal brakes. It is pure executive impulse weaponized through the bureaucracy. This is the high cost of the win. We got Maduro. But to do it, we had to act like a rogue state. We had to behave exactly the way we tell our adversaries not to behave. We are teaching the world that the rules are for the weak. We are teaching China and Russia that international law is just a rhetoric you use to slow down your enemies, but one you ignore when you have the strength to do so. This is the tragedy of Trumpism as a strategic doctrine. It can achieve short-term dominance, it can smash targets, it can seize assets, but it cannot build, it cannot sustain. It burns the very capital, institutional trust, moral authority, legal consistency, that allows the United States to lead the world rather than just rule it. So do not look at this operation as an anomaly. Do not treat it as a one-off event driven by a unique president. Treat it as a stress test that the system failed. The machinery of American power worked, yes. The SEALs landed. The target was acquired. The oil is secured. But the internal logic that keeps that power democratic, that keeps it accountable, and that keeps it legitimate, has been snapped. The problem we face now is not the man sitting in a cell in Florida. The problem is the method we used to put him there. Because that method is now a precedent, and precedents, once set, are incredibly difficult to undo. We have proven that we can win by breaking the system. The question is, how long can the system survive that kind of winning? We need to answer the final question, the only question that really matters in the long run. So what? We have the man, we have the oil. The operation is, by every tactical metric, a success. Why should the average American care about legal theories or diplomatic protocols when the outcome looks like a victory? The answer is not about morality. It is about the physics of power. When you tear up the rules to achieve a short-term win, you do not just delete those rules for yourself. You delete them for everyone. We have just introduced a new standard into international relations, the weaponization of domestic criminal law to justify regime change. And we need to understand that this precedent travels. It will not stay in Caracas. We have just handed a playbook to our adversaries. We have validated the idea that if a nation defines a foreign leader as a criminal, they have the right to cross borders and take them. How does the United States respond when Beijing designates a Taiwanese leader as a violator of Chinese domestic law and launches an arrest operation? How do we argue against it? Do we cite the sovereignty we just violated? Do we cite the international norms we just bypassed? We have stripped the gears of our own diplomatic defense. We have traded our standing as the architect of the international order for the role of its most aggressive exemptionalist. We have made it infinitely harder to condemn Russian aggression or Chinese expansionism because we have just adopted their methods. Closer to home, the damage is even more concrete. Look at Latin America. For decades, the United States has tried to shed the reputation of the heavy-handed imperial neighbor. We have spent billions on soft power, on partnerships, on trying to build a hemisphere based on shared interests rather than fear. In 48 hours, we torched that progress. We have confirmed the oldest, deepest paranoia of the region, that American partnership is conditional, and American sovereignty is absolute. We have narrowed our diplomatic space down to a pinpoint. From this moment on, no Latin American leader can negotiate with the United States without wondering if they are one policy disagreement away from an indictment and a Navy SEAL team. You can get compliance that way. You can force nations to fall in line. But you cannot get allies. You cannot get stability. You get a hemisphere that fears you, resents you, and waits for the moment you blink. This is the trajectory we are on. It is a trajectory of isolation disguised as dominance. We look strong right now. We look decisive. But it is a brittle strength. It relies entirely on the threat of force rather than the durability of institutions. And the history of empire tells us one thing very clearly. You cannot garrison the entire world. You need partners. You need rules that people follow voluntarily because they believe the system works. We have just announced that the system is optional. This situation is not easily reversible. You cannot uncross a line like this. We cannot go back to the world and say, "That was a one-time exception. Trust us again." Trust does not work that way. The United States remains the most powerful nation on earth. We have the ships, we have the economy, and we have the energy. But we are choosing a path that weakens the foundations that make that power sustainable. We are choosing the shortcut. And the problem with shortcuts in geopolitics is that they usually lead to a cliff. America remains powerful, but power without discipline becomes fragile. And right now, we are looking very, very fragile.